Joining us on the broadcast is Isobel Archer, a program manager for migrant workers in Gulf at the BHRRC. Isobel's work exposes Qatar's hospitality sector and its silent abuse of workers since a very long time. We're going to talk to Isobel. Isobel, appreciate you speaking to us and taking out the time. The first question that comes to my mind is that you've conducted a survey of 19 multinational hotel chains to find out how they are treating immigrant workers in Qatar. What did you find out?
I think what was really important about that report was that we were able to collect testimony from workers who had actually been working in hotels or were either currently working in hotels or who had recently returned, to ask them their personal experience of employment in Qatar and in those hotels. And the first thing to note was that that testimony had to remain anonymous. All of those workers were only able to give consent to be interviewed owing to the fact that we were keeping their testimony anonymous. And that really speaks to the very real risk of reprisal from employers against those workers that is ever present for all workers in Qatar. And many of the workers who were interviewed really described a full range of labour abuse, including many practices that are considered indicators of forced labour. So almost all of those workers reported that conditions of employment were being violated for them. So that might have included delayed wages or that employment wasn't quite what they had expected or been told to expect. Almost half of all of the workers who were interviewed had paid extortionate or illegal recruitment fees. And all of the workers who were asked particularly about whether or not they had been able to or felt able to change jobs if they wished, cited that there were barriers to doing that. And then finally, many of them also cited experience of discrimination, racial discrimination. So that involved, disparities in pay and also disparities in how the roles that they were able to access in Qatar. But in terms of what the companies told us and how transparent they were in their answers to the questions that we posed, we did see one or two examples where, we could speak to brands who were engaging more meaningfully with human rights, particularly in this context where we know that labour rights are still severely curtailed. But overall, there was an alarming lack of due diligence on, for example, worker welfare principles and the standards that were being espoused by business partners. So that might have been labour suppliers or recruitment agencies that brands were using. Overall, we also saw a lower level of transparency than we would expect to see from other brands. Obviously, the Resource Centre does these kinds of surveys on other industries as well. And I would say that particularly compared with, for example, the apparel industry, the hotels that we surveyed were significantly more opaque in terms of their business relationships, the steps they were undertaking to safeguard their workforce. And then we also saw a lack of monitoring of the conditions of subcontracted workers. And this was something which also came out of the testimony that was gathered. There was a disparity between the experiences of directly employed workers and workers who might be working in the hotel but were employed by, for example, an external security company or a housekeeping company or a cleaning company that deployed workers to the hotel. And we saw that brands had not really taken into account the risk that those subcontracted workers were facing and put in place measures to adequately monitor the working conditions of those workers.
Isobel, your survey says that only 4 out of the 19 hotels disclosed who were supplying labour to them. Why are they afraid of disclosing this particular information? What are they trying to hide?
Well, disclosure of information like that, so who companies are partnering with and their business relationships, has long been a staple feature of corporate transparency. And it's an important part that allows both companies to assess the risk of their business operations and also external stakeholders. So, the fact that a company would be disclosing that kind of information would signal, a welcome understanding that they are allowing themselves to be scrutinized by, for example, rights groups, but also by other stakeholders such as investors who can look at what that means for risk and that company. So the fact that there was very little transparency was extremely disappointing. In terms of why brands withheld that information, we didn't have a lot of explicit sort of clarity on around why that would be, but certainly one of the concerns I can speak to anecdotally has been that companies simply don't want to be scrutinized. Often if it's the case that human rights risks or labour rights risks have been associated with a supplier or a recruitment agency, that basically constitutes bad press for a company. And I think what we would say to that is, this is less around generating bad press, but more around being open to being scrutinised, to being open to saying, if there are human rights risks associated with a labour supplier or with a recruitment agency, our question would be, what is the company doing to address those risks? And for us, that's far more of a success story to be able to highlight when brands recognise those risks. But it has to start from that transparency. And that's something, I can definitely say that our most recent interactions with many of the same brands who were surveyed last year shows some improvement in this area. I think that brands are now seeing the importance of being transparent, and certainly we will be highlighting those brands who are. There is still room for improvement until we see the sort of level of transparency among hotels that we have also seen among other sectors.
Isobel, Qatar claims, they say that they have abolished the horrendous Kafala system, but that's far from the truth. We know that. Can you tell our viewers what you've learned about this system, how oppressive it actually is?
Well, Kafala is essentially a system of control. It refers to a range of practices which enable an employer to retain control over the movements and really every aspect of that worker's life, not just their working conditions and their employment conditions, but also their movements, their living conditions, whether or not they can even leave employment or leave the country. And we have seen, Qatar has certainly been keen to stress that it has now abolished Kafala. This is the claim, and certainly from our perspective, actually, many of the reforms that have been passed in the past few years have gone a significant way to redressing this imbalance of power between employers and employees. So, for example, most recently, almost 2 years ago now, we saw that workers are no longer required to obtain permission from their employer if they wish to change employment or if they wish to leave the country. And this was a really significant development, and I think it's important to recognise that has now changed. I think what's concerning is that while these reforms are certainly very strong and go a significant way to, as I say, redressing that power imbalance, it was very clear to us, and actually we were really quite shocked by some of the testimony that workers gave us on this particular issue for last year's report. So we know that from workers' own experiences, there are still a number of different barriers to allowing workers to change jobs easily or to leave the country. And really that ranged from workers who told us that they weren't aware of the reforms at all, to workers who said, yes, I can change jobs, I know how to do that. I need to wait until the end of my contract, which is not the case. There is now a notice period that needs to be served, and workers should be able to change jobs. We also had workers say, yes, I can change jobs, I just need to submit a resignation letter in writing to my employer. And that's also not the case. It's been made very clear by the ILO, and I believe the Labour Ministry, that is not a requirement under the new system. But in the worst instances, we actually heard from workers who were saying, I've never even tried to use the system. I would not use the system because I am very afraid that my employer will take steps to retaliate against me. I'm afraid I will be detained if I ask for this. I'm afraid I will be deported if I try and change jobs. And, we know that official numbers are that thousands of workers have successfully used the new system to be able to change jobs. But actually none of the workers who were interviewed and spoke to their experiences for our report, none of them would actually have shown up in those figures, because it wasn't that people were using the system and it was being rejected. It was that they were citing reasons for not even using the system properly or at all. And so I think that it was very concerning that workers were citing such strong convictions as detention and deportation as to why they weren't able to change jobs still. And one particular factor that really needs calling out is that, it's still possible for employers to file absconding charges against workers, which means that they can file a criminal complaint. And I think that the fact that that's still possible means that there is still that fundamental disadvantage for workers if they are employed by particularly unscrupulous employers. And I think it's also worth highlighting that from the answers we had from companies themselves, it was also clear, and this is something which has come out through our sort of informal engagement with other companies, not just hotels, that companies are still not clear necessarily of exactly what is and isn't required to allow workers to change jobs.
Isobel, in your survey, you've also mentioned that workers had said that they had paid a recruitment fee. What is that all about, and how bad is the situation in Qatar because of that?
Recruitment fees is an issue which often goes really to the heart of an exploitative or potentially exploitative situation for migrant workers. Recruitment fees are, it's an umbrella term that really refers to any form of payment to enable that worker to take up employment in another, to take up employment. So that might be that workers are being requested to pay their own airfare, their own air tickets to get to the country where they will be employed. They might be requested to pay a processing fee, to pay for their own medical checks and medical certification, qualification checks, the cost of buying a uniform, anything that would be required of the worker to enable them to take up that job. And I think that the reason why they are so nefarious is that these costs often run into the hundreds or even thousands of dollars. So to be able to pay that cost, many workers are taking out loans. That might be informal loans from, say, close family member or a friend, or a formalised loan from a bank to be able to pay their way to take up employment. And in many cases, actually, it takes months, even over a year, to pay off that debt because of the very low wages that they are actually being paid. It's very difficult to easily pay that off or pay it off quickly. And I think this is a particular concern that we, and I know other rights groups working on these issues, have, particularly this year. We're now 5 months out from the World Cup. We know that many workers are undertaking sort of shorter term contracts for the duration of the tournament. And in many instances, it will be the case that if they have paid recruitment fees to take up that employment, they may not be in employment long enough to actually pay off the debt, let alone save anything for themselves. And I think that's why we are particularly concerned on that special issue for the remainder of this year. And I think it's also important to flag, recruitment fees are illegal in Qatar. This is not something which hasn't been, again, rectified on paper. So I think it's really important to question what employers can do to pick up whether recruitment fees have been paid and their role in this. And this is something which we believe is not being engaged with in as meaningful or as thorough a way by employers to be able to identify when recruitment fees have been paid, what they consider to be recruitment fees. We often hear from employers, well, we ban recruitment fees, but we don't hear a further commitment from employers that if they find that recruitment fees have been paid, they then reimburse the worker. And that's got to be a crucial next step to ensure that remedy is accessible if workers have paid fees, that they are reimbursed, but also that if employers find a particular agency that they use has been charging illegal or extortionate fees, that there is a constructive engagement by the employer with that agency to make sure that the agency improves its practices, that no more workers are charged, and that situation is improved. And instead of that, what we've also seen is employers simply cutting contracts with agencies where they're concerned that there might be an issue. This does nothing to improve the situation for either workers who have already been charged fees or future workers who will use that agency, to gain employment. Again, often this speaks to the fact that, the brand of the company doesn't want bad press. They don't want to be associated with anything that might, appear negatively. But it's something which, certainly for us, best practice would be for companies and brands to engage meaningfully with agencies where these practices are happening, rectify the situation and improve that for workers themselves.
And Isobel, if all of this is true, how come multinational hospitality brands continue to operate with such blatant abuse of labor in Qatar?
So really there are two main aspects, I think, to that question. The first is that there has been a historic lack of accountability for this particular sector. So, as I mentioned, the Resource Centre has a focus on many different sectors around the world. And I think when we compare the hotels to the scrutiny that maybe a sector such as the apparel sector has faced, it's quite clear that there has been significant focus on the practices of apparel brands and issues around conditions for work, for people who perhaps work in garment factories in, for example, South Asia. And there has not been as much scrutiny on the service sector, like hotels or other hospitality sectors like food and catering. But I think secondly, and this is specific to the region, to the Gulf region, it's very difficult to get transparency on people's experiences. We heard it in the testimony from the workers who spoke to our report last year. There is a genuine fear that people feel, which means that they are afraid to speak out about what is happening. And it's very difficult to get that kind of independent scrutiny, from rights groups themselves on what people are experiencing to be able to, redress any problems. But I also think, we do need to still acknowledge some improvement. As I said, we're currently exchanging with some of the same brands, and I think there has been some improvement, and we'll certainly be pleased to highlight that. But overall, those two factors compounded, the lack of accountability for companies and the lack of transparency on workers' experiences, means that it has allowed brands to foster this sort of lack of responsibility and real lack of acknowledgement of their role to respect human rights.
Isobel, the big question is, what precedent is the FIFA setting by turning a blind eye to labor abuse in the country of Qatar? And do you think that the World Cup at Qatar definitely now needs to be boycotted by one and all?
We don't take a specific position on boycotts, and I think at this stage the tournament, it's very clear that the tournament is going ahead. Almost all of the teams who are going to be participating have qualified, so the conversation now needs to be constructive. What can be done in these last 5 months, both from the perspective of the companies that we've historically been engaging with, hotels, but also from the point of view of the other stakeholders involved specifically in this tournament. I think that FIFA has now started engaging with hotel brands as well. There have been efforts, particularly in this last calendar year, where together with the International Labour Organization that has an office in Qatar and the Ministry of Labour and the worker organisers, they are now engaging with brands. But I think that there is still plenty to be done for these other stakeholders. So, for example, our attention at the Resource Centre has now turned to stakeholders such as the football associations and such as the corporate sponsors who will be travelling to Qatar, who will be using many of these services, who will be booking hotels. We've been engaging with football associations to ask them questions around how they are conducting human rights due diligence on their participation in the tournament. Many of those teams have already booked hotels or are in the process of finding training sites. And I think it's really important that as they do that, and we've certainly been urging them to do so, to engage with human rights, to understand that when they are in Qatar, there is a possibility that they may negatively impact migrant workers' rights because of the potential exploitation that those workers are exposed to. The main thing I think we need to stress is that there is a role still in these last 5 months for those actors to be raising awareness, to be using their platforms, to be leveraging the kind of attention that the World Cup tournament will have to spotlight some of these issues and to continue making sure that not just up until November and December and during the duration, during the tournament itself, but actually beyond that, to make sure that any abuse that happens between now and the tournament and during the tournament is identified and is remedied.
Okay, Isobel, I appreciate you joining us and filling us in on a lot of these important details that perhaps the world is not privy to.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.